I just fell in love with space law head over heels, and I started writing articles about it. I don't actually work in the commercial space industry. I've spoken about it. I've taught it at University of Houston Law School. I wrote a book, and I co-authored it with 2 other authors. It's called The Laws of Spaceflight, a guidebook for new space lawyers. And then I got an LLM, and after I wrote the book that has become a textbook in a lot of space law classes, I took an LLM in space law. It was Space, Cyber, and Telecommunications Law. And then I started 2 small aerospace physiological consulting companies for extreme environments such as Airspace and/or high altitude jumps. So that's kind of my background and how I ended up into this particular topic. So today is just to give an introduction, just a little primer on what the commercial space industry is and what it looks like, so that if you hear about it, it's not just this big, amorphous blob of information out there. So, commercial space, and I was going to say, I really love commercial space, and people think I'm talking about warehouses. It's like, no. I'm not that in love with where, it's okay. So what is commercial space, right? So it's commercial space transportation not provided by the U.S. government or any other government. And that's really been the big change, the big revolution, is that the U.S. government pulled itself out of providing commercial space transportation, in a kind of monopoly manner when it ended the shuttle program. And it has gone into the commercial space industry to try to find a provider so that it can purchase the services from commercial space providers. It also opens up the market to any buyer for a reasonable amount. So we're not talking about tens of millions of dollars to get a seat on a flight to space. And if the U.S. government is not the only one offering these services, it means that private companies, that we're going to talk about later, can find private customers to offer these types of services. Now, obviously, we're going to talk a little bit later. There's tourists, that's fine, but it also opens up for research. Microgravity is a very interesting, important environment in which to study. And so it just opens up the field to a whole variety of other entities and individuals. And actually, CFR is the Code of Federal Regulations, and there's actually a chapter 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations which specifically addresses the licensing of commercial spaceflight in the United States. And in fact, the United States is one of the most comprehensive commercial spaceflight codes, which is actually in chapter 50, it's 51 United States Code, then you look up the rest. I was trying not to get legalistic. Usually these talks are very legalistic, so I stayed the heck away from that. And so the United States really has a very comprehensive code and regulations regarding commercial human spaceflight, which is leaps and bounds ahead of where we actually are today. So the first thing to understand, which is why it's the first thing that we have to understand when you're talking about the commercial spaceflight industry, is that there's an orbital world and then there's a suborbital world. And the two are very different technology, very different price points, very different utilities, very different customer base. And so the first thing when you're talking about space flight is to understand the difference between the two. So the hard part, the reason they're very, very different is because the hard part is not actually getting to space, it's getting there fast enough so that you'll stay there. And that's what you mean when you say orbital velocity, is that you need to get to space fast enough that you're going to reach orbital velocity and stay in orbit. Why? Because once you are in orbit, once you've achieved that, you will stay there, quote unquote, forever. There's such a thing as orbital decay, which means that, for example, the space station does slowly come back down and will slowly decay its orbit, and if left to its own devices would crash back into the atmosphere eventually, and every now and again it gives itself a little boost to stay up. But basically, if you go fast enough and you stay in orbit, you can stay there, which is why satellites stay up there. So this is a lawyer trying to explain a scientific concept, so you gotta bear with me. So basically, here's the thing, right? If you throw a ball, you see that dude? That's not me. Okay. So So that if he throws the ball, right, it's following a path, right? If you throw it fast enough, it would go so fast that it would start following the curvature of the Earth. And if it was outside the atmosphere, because air will really slow things down, you could get to the point where you throw it fast enough that it would actually just keep going. And that's what you're talking about when you're talking about orbital velocity. That is going fast enough that it's just going to keep going around the Earth. That is orbital, okay? Suborbital never actually reaches orbital velocity. Now, suborbital flight is like the Virgin Galactics and the X-4s of the world, okay? The reason that they can just take off and do a suborbital flight is because they don't have a chance in hell to actually stay up there. And the whole flight takes 2 hours. You get 5 minutes of weightlessness, okay? And then you come back down to Earth. And why does that make a big difference? Because in order, so this is just to give you an idea, okay? To go to suborbital, to go to 100 kilometers, which is, okay, we're going to have a policy conversation here. Unofficially for the United States, for the whole world, the border between airspace and space is 100 kilometers. That is an unofficial boundary. It basically splits this way. Countries that have space programs don't recognize it. Countries that don't have space programs recognize it. Scientifically speaking, people agree it's about 100 kilometers. The US doesn't recognize it for a variety of reasons, most of which are they don't want to be held down to having to give warnings regarding overflight. If they're at like 90 kilometers over another country, they can say, well, we're close enough to space. But, okay, unofficially, and actually some branches of the armed forces actually recognize 100 kilometers. You get astronaut wings if you go over 100 kilometers. But, okay, so it doesn't matter. Unofficially, it's 100 kilometers. For suborbital flights, which means no chance of actually staying in orbit, you have to go at 950 meters per second. And then I was like, that's not going to mean much. So 2,125 miles per hour. That's really fast, okay? All right. But it's not actually crazy fast. It's fast. To get to 200 kilometers suborbital flight, which means, again, you're fast enough to get through all of the atmosphere, push all of that air out of the way, get all the way up there, but you're going to come back down. You're a guy with a really fast ball who can get it all the way up there, but it's not fast enough to keep going around and around and around, right? You're just like a kid who threw it up and then it's going to come back down. You have to go at 3,590 miles per hour. I want you to compare it to how fast you would have to throw that ball, you know, that rocket, that vehicle, for it to go orbital at 200 kilometers. It'd be 17,400 miles per hour. This is why companies like Virgin Galactic and X4 can do suborbital flights, because the technology involved, the speed involved, the amount of fuel you have to put on that thing is orders of magnitude smaller than when you're trying to get a capsule to actually make it into orbit, or if you're trying to get a satellite to actually make it into orbit. Orders of magnitude smaller. If you go to 400 kilometers, you're still only 5,368 miles per hour. It's like, yes, it's fast, but it's still less than a third of the speed you would have to get to go half as high and stay in suborbital. It's then staying in an orbital trajectory, okay? This is why the two industries are so separate. Okay, so who are the players, right? In orbital, the big ones, the ones we know about, are space in the US. SpaceX, Boeing, and NASA. In the suborbital sphere, there's a gazillion little companies, and I just have a couple there, but there's more than that. The big ones are Virgin Galactic, X4, Blue Origin, and Armadillo Airspace, and all they're doing is getting fast enough to hit 100 kilometers or just graze it and then come back down. The top two are doing human suborbital flights, are trying to, and the bottom two are doing non-human suborbital flights. And you're thinking, well, what's the point? The point is that you get 5 minutes of microgravity for very affordable prices. If you're a university and you want to run an experiment, you know how much it would cost you to get microgravity environment if you were trying to get it onto the ISS? It would be way out of your league. But if you're saying, I want to run an experiment for I just want to buy 5 minutes, maybe buy 5 times 5 minutes on a suborbital flight and see how my experiment does. If you're talking about Blue Origin, Orbital, Airspace, or X-Score, you can be talking about $5, $10, $15,000. That's completely affordable if you're running a research lab. So Orbital. Right now, for orbital spaceflight, which right now, what does that mean? For humans, it means going to the ISS, the International Space Station, okay? To go to the ISS, right now, the United States is purchasing each ticket, each seat, at $62.7 million, and I think the latest round was $70.6 million per seat. It's really pricey. There's only 3 seats, and one of them is always a Russian, because the Russian has to be the captain, has to be the pilot. And in fact, the Russians don't give their seats to the Europeans, but the Americans will, it might be sell, but they will give slots to the European Space Agency to get Europeans up into space as well. So what did NASA do? So NASA ended the shuttle program. That's a whole other lecture in itself. And then it started a series of funding rounds called CCDEV, CCI-CAP, CCI-CAP, which is the last one is Commercial Crew Transportation Capability. What does it do? It puts out billions of dollars, 4.2 to Boeing and 2.6 to SpaceX. And it said, find us a way to get us to the ISS. Because the idea is that these private companies will do it for cheaper, which they are. Right now, it looks like they're doing it for cheaper. And SpaceX has proven itself. It has started resupplying the ISS, not with crew, but with cargo. And it's done it several times. So it's proving itself repeatedly to be a reliable partner. So how do they do it? So another thing about the commercial space, this is just very basic concept, but whenever you're talking about an orbital provider, they're always going to have a launch vehicle, okay? And then they're gonna have a launcher, and then they're gonna have whatever their re-entry vehicle is going to be. Okay, so they're gonna have the launch, which is the big rocket, and then they're gonna have something on top to get us up and down. And the one thing that's very interesting about our current commercial industry is that we spent years on the shuttle, which is a plane, right? It's a winged vehicle. It would get shot up into the sky, and then it's like. The astronauts used to call it like it's a brick with wings. It wasn't really made for flying. It's made for gliding back down to Earth. But we have gone completely away from it. Both of the providers have decided the capsule is the way to go. Capsule is how we got to the moon. Capsule is Apollo. Capsule is Mercury. Redstone programs. It's the Gemini programs. I mean, capsule is how we did it for decades. And so what do they have? Well, Boeing and SpaceX have 2 different setups. SpaceX has the Dragon, which is a little capsule, and the Falcon 9, which is the rocket, which is the launcher. Boeing has the CST-100 Starliner, which is the capsule, and it'll use an Atlas V rocket, and the Atlas V rocket is just a proven. If you Google it, it is just a proven, has been used time and time and time again, piece of equipment, just very, very, tested. Both of them are looking at crews of 7, which would get us back to shuttle levels instead of having crews of 3, which are now in the Soyuz capsule. The Soyuz is the Russian capsule. So what do they look like? Okay, Apollo is how we got to the moon. Orion was NASA's plan for a capsule. CST-100 is the Boeing capsule, and the Dragon is the SpaceX capsule. That's what they look like. That's a picture of the Dragon capsule. And then SpaceX actually that's one way that it makes money. It sells launchers, and those are the Falcon 9s. You see, those are the sizes. Falcon XX is massive. The Falcon X Heavy is massive. And this just depends how far up you want to go. Remember, because I said further up you want to go into orbital and reach orbital velocity, the more you need more fuel. And that's really your driving force. You need more fuel. You need a ton. Like a ton is just an understatement. Like you need a ton of fuel. And and once you've actually looked at this and you've thought about it that way, I encourage you to go to Spaceports. You don't have to do the whole, it's fine if you do, you pay your entry and you go do the whole tour NASA. But Spaceports is free. I take my kids all the time. It's free, and it's indoors. And you will, once you understand it, you'll be fascinated by the fact that you will see each of the stages. And each of the stages, if you think about it one way, is just a way to get fuel. Like you take the fuel, and then you take the fuel receptacle as far as you really need it to go, and then you drop it, because you're just transporting a whole heck of a lot of fuel to get up into space. And that's what it looks like, which gives you a sense of the size, right? I mean, that's the capsule up there. It's teeny-weeny, but it carries a lot of people. Okay, this is a rendition, it's not an actual picture, rendition of the Starliner. And this was an Atlas V that I was able to find, but there's a million of them. So there have been, so let's talk about human spaceflight. What does that mean? There have been orbital tourists. There have been people who've gone to the ISS. How much have they paid? At the beginning, they paid $20 million, $40 million. I think right now the price is closer to $60 million to get up on the ISS for one trip, 2 days, and you go up with the Russians. So Dennis Tito, and how do you do that? You do that through a private, you do that through a company. I think it's a private, I think it's a partnership with the Russian government, but it's a private company that actually negotiates with the Russians for seats and sells the seats to individuals. Dennis Tito was the first one. He went up for 8 days for $20 million. Anousheh Ansari, 12 days, $20 million, a little bit later. Actually, what's interesting is that she was the backup, and the person who was supposed to go in her stead, who's supposed to go, had to drop out. He was a Japanese, very wealthy man, whose name I don't remember. And so she was able to step in at the last minute and take over the seat. And then Guy La Liberté, 11 days, $40 million. So people have gone to the ISS, but this is not a easily achievable price point, obviously. So so if you had, and that's orbital, right? Okay. So let's talk a little about suborbital, because suborbital it's expensive, but it's more within the realm of possibility for people. So where would they fly out? Well, it turns out the United States has a ton of spaceports. And how do you become a spaceport? Well, you go to the FAA, because the FAA is actually the entity that is entitled, has jurisdiction to license commercial human spaceflight activities in the United States. So, spaceports. There's a ton. These are just a few examples. There's the Spaceport America, which is in New Mexico. It's the one that has the partnership with Virgin Galactic. Very famous. Everybody talks about it. There's the Mojave Air and Spaceport out in California. I've been there. And Virgin has some operations there. X-Corp has operations there. And it's there. Midland Spaceport is getting more and more active. X-Corp is about to move its test flights to to Midland Spaceport out in West Texas. There's Ellington. It got licensed as a spaceport, but not for flights. It's basically going to be a spaceport for commercial space-related operations, research, and things of that nature, but there's no plan to actually have commercial spaceflight take off from there for now. But it makes sense, actually, and we can talk about it very briefly afterwards. There's the Oklahoma Spaceport in Oklahoma. There's the Cape Canaveral Spaceport in Florida, and there's the Cecil Spaceport. And the big differences between the two is that, and the big difference is, when you look at spaceports now, when you listen to talks about them and so on and so forth, there's a big distinction which ones offer vertical takeoff, which ones offer horizontal takeoff, and which ones offer both. Why does that matter? A vertical takeoff is for going up like this. It's usually associated with a capsule mechanism that we looked at earlier. Thank you so much. Thank you. But horizontal takeoff, it's taking off like a plane, and that's actually what the suborbital market looks like right now. We're going to talk about it a little bit more, because the two entities that are closest to providing suborbital flights are taking winged. And why can they do that? Because you don't have to go as fast, so you don't have to have all that heck of a lot of fuel. It's enough for you to get up, fly, come back down. So suborbital. The two ones I'm going to talk about briefly are X-Corp and Virgin Galactic. X-Corp has the Lynx vehicle. That's what it looks like. It's very cute. I got to sit in a mock-up of one. Actually, I think it might have been a real one. It was in a hangar in California. Sit in it in 4-inch heels, so you can get into it in 4-inch heels. And you can get out of it, so that's pretty good. And I sat in the pilot seat. So, of course. So it carries 2 people. It's a very small vehicle, one for the pilot and one for the passenger. And the pilot's it's like this, and the passenger is here, just a little bit behind, but on the side. And the idea is to give the passenger a pilot-like experience, so they're not sitting in the back, so they kind of have a front line view of things. The idea is to also have scientific experiments and maybe nanosats on it, so it'll be, filled up with a whole bunch of other things other than this one person. The price started about $90,000 a few years ago, but is now up to $150,000. There have been 0 flights so far. They're still just testing. They're testing and testing and testing and testing. But so far, no flights. And the idea is to take off from Curacao. Because the concept is to make it a luxury vacation. So you go to Curacao, you sit on the beach, you do your thing, you take your suborbital flight, you come back down. Because the point is, the point is that this is it's a lot. It's just 2 hours, that's it. You're up, you're down, you have 5 minutes of happiness. That's like a lot of work just to get there. So, you got to kind of make the front end and back end more interesting. Virgin Galactic has a bit of a different model. It's 1 crew and 6 passengers. The flights used to were about $200,000. They're now at $250,000. There have been 0 actual flights. There have been a lot of test flights. 700 people have prepaid their flights, so a lot of money has been shelled out to Virgin Galactic. The idea is to fly out of Spaceport America. Now, it's a little bit different the way it works. White Knight 2 carries Spaceship 2. White Knight 2 releases Spaceship 2. Spaceship 2 engages into the suborbital flight and comes back down. Okay? So basically they have a carrier to take the plane up. That's what it looks like from the bottom. White Knight 2 is basically the 2 white ones on the side, and then there's one that you can't see because it's covered. The blue bottom is Spaceship 2. And this is what it looks like. See, it carries it. And then Spaceship 2 has to take off and keep going up and then come back down. So federal regulations, just very briefly. The United States government does not certify commercial spaceflight as safe. It licenses the activity. The idea is that the people on board, and I have a great quote, but it was too long to put in there. Congress made the determination that people who engage in commercial human spaceflight are, quote, daredevils and visionaries and adventurers, and that they take on, and then the quote goes on, basically they take on these risks at their own peril. They choose to test out new technologies at their own peril. And so the idea is that the US government is not going to infringe on these new companies' ability to design and innovate and try something new by imposing design requirements that maybe are not the most effective or efficient or cost appropriate, and that it's important to give them a playground, give the companies a playground to test and try and fail and then get better. So there's no safety requirements for the people on board. There is what's called an acceptable risk level for the uninvolved public, and the FAA is very careful about that. In 2004, the Commercial Space Launch Amendment Act, for the first time, codified commercial human spaceflight regulations. And in 2014, there was and since then there's been several times that everything has come up for discussion and extension. So there's 2 particular provisions that are important to understand, especially because I read a lot of articles and a lot of them are so wrong, and it's just painful. One of them is, there's actually what they call a design moratorium, and that's what I was talking about, that there's this playing field that's just allowed to be open. And in 2015, this year, the design moratorium was extended for 10 more years. So the commercial space industry has 10 more years to design and experiment and try to figure out what designs are best and safest and most cost effective and efficient and so on and so forth. And the FAA will not meddle unless there's a big accident or a catastrophic loss or something of that nature. And then there's a risk sharing regime, which was actually first enacted because we were trying to compete with the French. And the Airspace program, which is the workhorse of the commercial satellite industry, orbital but satellites, so they send satellites up constantly, just machines. The French government has a fantastic risk-sharing regime, which is basically if you insure yourself, and it changes depending on how much the euro is against the dollar and inflation and so on and so forth. But it's about $75 million. If you insure yourself up to $75 million, if you have a loss to third parties or to governments, or if you damage property, other people's property, the French government will cover you for anything over $75 million. Fantastic deal. So when Airspace came up with that, the Americans were like, that doesn't make us very competitive. So what they did is said, you have to find yourself insurance up to your maximum probable loss, which is what the FAA calculates. So the FAA calculates how much damage you are likely to cause to third parties and to the government if something goes wrong. So they say you insure yourself up to that amount. We will cover you for $2.5 billion above that. But anything above that, it's back to you. And so we have that's what we call the risk-sharing regime under U.S. law. And that's been extended until 2025. And that's it. That's my introduction to the commercial space industry. Who gets dibs?
Yeah, I want to answer it. But how far are we away from it? Like, I vaguely remember hearing something about like international travel, like so using.
Oh, point to point.
Yeah, point to point.
Yes. So their big dream is to do point to point travel, right? You could go Tokyo, New York in like 2 hours. That'd be amazing. I think we're far from it. Not from a technology or whale standpoint, but it's just we can't even get suborbital flights going. Like get up and come back down exactly where you took off. So I think once we get to that, the point to point is child's play. I mean, it's child's play once we get there, but we can't seem to get there. And Virgin Galactic has been promising for years, next year's our flight, next year's our flight, in 2 years is our flight. Now they don't even bother promising anymore. They're like, it'll happen, just let us be. And the links for the X-Core is the same thing, which is, I just keep hoping because I'm in love with the industry, but it hasn't happened. Yeah. Oh, okay. Let's go out. Okay, go.
When the space shuttle program started to go away and all of the NASA started to contract during that time, the military really was ramping up in their space program and classifying so much information. And so you had this whole secret space program with the military and all that. But up until that ramped up, NASA had been pretty open about its technology and that sort of thing, shared it. So I'm wondering how that kind of now secret system might affect the future of commercial space flight.
So SpaceX has been doing just fine. Boeing is doing just fine, and NASA is still very open about its technology. For example, right now it's in a licensing process where it literally just puts all its inventions online. If you want to license it, you pay a license and you go and you commercialize it. So it doesn't seem to have slowed down anybody.
You were going to comment.
Yeah.
You were going to comment about Ellington.
Yeah.
And why it's.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Good point. The thing that all of the spaceports, the active spaceports, have in common is that they're either very close to the sea or very close to nothing. Just big open desert spaces, right? And Ellington is not really either. It's close-ish to the sea, and but it has populations around it. So I don't know how willing they're going to be to actually have takeoff and landing happen there. It could I mean, it's not unthinkable because we are closest to the sea and it could be worked out for it to work. But the other spaceports are just, Mojave, there's nothing around it. In Midland, there's nothing around it. And that's why Ellington's a little bit atypical from that perspective. And the Florida ones are right over the water. You have to be able to launch over nothing. Yeah?
Why do space tourists seem to pay a lot less than NASA astronauts for seats?
So right now the space tourists are, this was old numbers, and as I said, right now we're closer to 60 million. So I don't actually think they're paying a lot less. I think the prices have gone together. I think right now they're looking about 60, 65 million. I think they're paying close to what we're paying.
On the slide you had about the length of the flights, 11 days, 12 days, most of that time it's on the ISS?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, those are actual days on. I think those are actually length of stay. They try to keep you for under 2 weeks. Over 2 weeks would be really interesting scientifically, to have like a guinea pig get up there. I'd totally do it, but they say less than 2 weeks.
That's the plan for it.
Okay.
Let's thank Giugi.